Okay, so I've let this dry pretty well totally, and so it's up in here. It's very slightly damp to the touch. You can tell that it's damp because it feels cool. Um, as you probably can tell, maybe you can't tell in this video, but when this dries, it actually dries a little bit lighter than what it was originally. So if I want a really deep blue sky like this, I actually had to have fairly thick paint. So the thicker my paint is, the more intense the colors will be on the page. So I have mixed this paint about the consistency of heavy cream. I don't want to use it straight out of the tube because then it's so thick it won't spread on the page. But I want it thick enough that when it dries, it will stay with a nice thick layer of paint there to make it dark. But it does look a little bit lighter here than original, but I don't mind. I'm not going to touch any of that. The only thing I'm going to work on now is down in this lower part of the painting to get some of this darker side of these clouds in here, which will also allow these little white ones to show just a bit more. And then I'm going to dry it with the hairdryer and then come back and do the rest of these. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Now, that's a little bit gray down in there, but it is on the blue side. And to mix gray, we can take the blue that I mixed up before, which was the ultramarine blue, and had a little phthalo in it, but that's fine. I'm going to put it in my other pan here that had some gray mixed in it, but I'm going to use a little bit of burnt sienna. So I'm using the opposite color on the color wheel. So burnt sienna is on the orange side. The blue is, opposite on the color wheel. And I'm going to just put it over in one corner here so I know how much I'm adding. And then I can slowly pull that in until I have a gray that I like. And if it's still a little too blue, which I think it is, I can get a little more burnt sienna. My burnt sienna is pretty dry in my pan there, so I'm not picking up very much at once with my brush. If I were to use paint directly out of the tube, I'd have to be very careful how much I picked up because it'd be wet and really get on my brush very easily. Now that's coming into a gray that I think looks interesting. And if it might need I'm going to say it needs a little blue back into it. Just looking at what's in my picture. All right, so now the value down in here, just look in my value card. My value of that gray is somewhere about here at value 7, maybe value 8. But my clouds, they're up here in value 10. And my hill there is way up here at value 2, the top of it. So it's going to stand out pretty dark against there. These are not as dark. They're not going to stand out as much. So, but before I can do anything with that hill, and I know the hill's all going to be darker than what's behind it, so I can finish what's behind it, just keeping it sort of smooth looking, and then finish the front. So we are wanting to come in here and just get a little, and that's too dark. So I'm going to lift this, rinse it a little bit. Okay. And now that I've got it down on the page, I want some more blue added into there. Okay. And I want to keep this light here as I work my way across here with this. So I'm just sort of putting down a little dark bottom to this, and then I'm going to rinse my brush, dry it halfway on my rag. The rag is extremely important because that's what we use to control how much water is on our brush. If I have too much water, it's just going to bleed right into what I just put down. If I don't have enough water, then it won't move the paint around. It's probably the trickiest thing to learn when we first start doing watercolor. I want at the bottom of this, I want to have it sort of soft because we're going to have those mountains come in there, and I don't want this interrupting them too much. And then the top of this, we want to keep some of that light. So just coming in here. Notice that it's getting a little lighter as I work through there, but I'm going to leave some darker streaks behind. It's too much water. Get a little less water. I can tell when it's too much water because everything starts pushing away. And then up in here, this can sort of come up into that a little bit. It's already starting to dry there, so I've got to be careful how much I try and work at once, because if I'm not careful, I'm going to end up having places that have started drying on me that I can't control. So what the other tricky thing I think in watercolor is learning how much we can do before we need to stop, or not do any more, where we can start and stop on things. Now I want some of this to come up and just find that, not just be a straight edge there, sort of find the edges of those. Oh, I'm liking that a little better now. And then the thicker the paint is, the less it's going to move around. So I'm coming back in with a little bit thicker paint and dropping it into this damp. Maybe let some of this, maybe we let some of those be a little darker cloud coming on top of there. That'll be sort of sweet. Take that up into those just a little bit. Just sort of thinking about how this all wants to sort of blow over this way. Okay, and I'm working at it from the side, so I'm needing to sort of turn and look at it just a little bit here. Let that soften there just a little bit. Let that soften a little tiny bit up there. Coming in with just a damp brush to do this softening and just sort of touching it. Okay, so now this has to be totally dry before I can do those hills. So I've got a hairdryer here, and we're going to take the hairdryer to this and dry it. Depending on how warm or cold the day is, how wet your paper is, all depends on how long it takes to dry. Okay, so we'll test that. Now I'm going to just take my hand close to it, but not quite touch. And if it still feels cool, it needs more drying. Go ahead and dry this up here too, because that was just still a little bit cool from before. So the other thing, I don't know if you noticed, I'm using a relatively big brush, and the reason I'm using a big brush is that it holds more paint, it holds more water, and I'm not going to be showing brush marks as easily. I had a little hard edge on there that I wanted to pick up. My brush marks won't show as much with this larger brush. When I get into doing smaller detail, you notice I pulled a small brush out to do some stuff earlier. Then we need to have a little bit smaller brush. So I might actually shift to a little bit smaller brush here. See, this was a 14. I'm going to knock down to a 12. I really like these Da Vinci Cosmetop Spin brushes. They're not overly expensive, but for what you pay for, you get a really nice brush that holds a lot of water. It keeps a good point, and they've got a little fatness to the handle, which is nice to hold. Okay, so now this gray, now this I've got to lean very slightly, I'm seeing a very slightly toward pink, so I'm going to put just a tiny bit of quinacridone gold into there, not gold, quinacridone rose into that gray, and back into a little red, a little of the ultramarine blue. Okay, so now I have not drawn my mountains on here. If you're at all uncomfortable about your drawing skills, I would recommend having those drawn in before you start any of the other part of the painting. You don't want to do any drawing once the paper is damp, because if you do, you're just going to dig holes in your paper. Okay, so let me just do this little bit of painting here, and going to be too dark. I can thin this down a little bit after I get going. So I'm just trying to find some of these shapes. And then this goes very thin. That's my cloud, so I don't want to get too high up there. Let's be careful. I'm probably should have, well, I didn't leave myself very much room for my mountains, but that's okay. Now, because I'm feeling like I'm not going to be able to control this, I want to stop now to thin this a little. Find some of those thinner spots. So I'm just thinning this back out where it is going to be a lighter gray. And then it comes down to a whole line where there's some green that's going to happen. It's going to be a thinner gray. And maybe there's just still a little more pinkish to that. And then I want that shape of this mountain to come down here. It's a little thinner. And then top of that mountain should go a little darker again. And I've screwed up a little bit on that shape, but I guess we're not going to worry about it. Although, here, let's do something. Let me just thin this out. That's going to work. One nice thing about using ultramarine blue is, hopefully this doesn't screw up what that shape looks like and how those, and we're going to have to put a little bit of blue back into this. Whoops, too much blue. And I'm going to just let that be soft. I might be sorry I did any of that. This is going to have a soft top there. I'm not going to have a nice hard edge because now this background is damp. I probably shouldn't have done that. Okay, so it's another mountain that comes up here, and it's a little bluer. So let's get a little more blue into this. And one reason to wait was to let that be dry just a little bit there. I don't like that color. So I've mixed a little bit more of the quinacridone rose into my mixture. I also have a little hair here. Don't want to do it with my fingernail, but with the tip of my brush I can sort of move that hair out of there. Getting somewhere where it doesn't matter. And then this is going to be a long, narrow run. And I'm going to have some more hills there. Okay. And I'm just seeing some shaping in here. Now that this is dried a little bit more, I can come in and darken that a little bit. Guess that looks okay. And then we can have a pale gray all down through here, even though it's going to have green on top of it, but none of that green is bright. So we can have a nice pale little gray here. And depending on whether I care whether the green bleeds a little bit, that needs to be blued down, I need to add just a little bit of burnt sienna into it to make it more of an olive green. And so I've added the ultramarine blue to it. I've added a little burnt sienna to sap green. And then we're going to have some little spots here. They're not everywhere. Let's make them uneven. And then at the very base, it's quite a bit of green. bit more dark in some of this green. Hopefully I haven't screwed all that up. Okay, so we have big blue sky. We were pretty light as we came down into the bottom here. We let that dry completely, and then we've done a dark foreground over top of it. And then in the very front of the foreground, we've added some light and dark to make the patterns come in here. And I'm just, something here, I don't know whether this is going to make it better or worse. I just want to get that feeling of that hill coming there. Okay, let me just leave that alone. You know, it's the temptation is always so great. Almost dry brush. I'm just going to lift a little bit here to make that one mountain stand out from the other. And where this is coming up and bleeding, we can come in with that snap. It's too late. I can maybe deal with that later if I care. This little spot here, I can't do anything with that until it's totally dry at this point. I can't do anything with that until it's totally dry either, because if I come in now, which I can show you coming in now, it's probably just going to bleed out into that sky again. Let me try it. Hoping that it's dried enough now that it's not going to. I should not have put anything in there until it was totally dry, because what happened is that then this gives me a damp intersection between this piece and that piece, and where it's damp, the two colors will start bleeding into each other. Okay, so I'm going to stop at this point. It might be that those mountains in the front need more work, and maybe not. So off we go.